The Gulf of Mexico hypoxic problem is a big problem. There's about 5,000 square miles of area where the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico is hypoxic, meaning there's no oxygen available to establish life for fish, invertebrates, and other types of life that require oxygen to live. And a lot of the times it's due to runoff from the Mississippi River. Now, by 2025, it was supposed to be reduced. The amount of nitrates and phosphates in the river systems were supposed to be reduced by 20%. But it doesn't look like they're going to meet their targets, even though there have been certain practices that have actually been implemented and working, but other practices have been implemented and working that aren't more about conservation, but more about applying fertilizers and other things to help maintain or increase the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus in the Mississippi River. Now, the Mississippi River covers a lot of area in the U.S., and so we need to talk about this on today's episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin. This is the podcast where you find out what's happening with the ocean, how you can speak up for the ocean, and what you can do to live for a better ocean by taking action. And on today's episode, we're going to be talking about the Mississippi River and the Gulf of Mexico and the hypoxic zone. It's a little bit of a personal thing for me and professional thing for me because I worked on the hypoxic zone when it was my first marine job. It was my second job coming out of university. I got to live on a boat in the Gulf of Mexico out of the LUMCON, Louisiana University's Marine Conservation Institute, where we got to work. We worked with Dr. Nancy Rabelais and her team to measure the hypoxic zone every year in the ocean. Now, I was only there for 8 months, but I got to spend one summer doing that. And it's always been a special thing to me because I just couldn't believe the amount of the size of the area that is considered hypoxic in the Gulf of Mexico. It ranges in size every year, but it hasn't been getting smaller and smaller on a downward trend. It's actually increasing. And to do that, I remember Dr. Nancy Rabelais having to testify in front of Congress to be able to say, hey, all these farms that are along the Mississippi River, which go all the way up to Minnesota, they're dumping their phosphorus and nitrogen into their fertilizers and chemicals and everything into the Gulf of Mexico or into the Mississippi River, which goes all the way down, accumulates, and then when it gets to the Gulf of Mexico, right at the mouth, things happen. We're going to talk about that in just a sec, but before we do, I just want to let you guys know, if you like this type of news and you want to hear more about this type of news so that you can be aware of what's happening in the ocean, that you can make better decisions, you can just sign up for our newsletter. It's if you go to speakupforblue.com/newsletter, that's speakupforblue.com/newsletter, you can get access in your inbox to news 5 days a week about the ocean. Now, this is something that I've been putting together for the last month or so. I also have it on LinkedIn, but this one's going right to your inbox. All you have to do is go to speakupforblue.com/newsletter, get access to that newsletter. It's going to be great. People are really liking it. You can respond to me and you get direct access to my email from there. It's just wonderful. So that's speakupforblue.com/newsletter. Sign up for that newsletter. Get 5 days a week to your inbox of ocean news and jobs too, by the way. And we also update you on the podcast. But regarding the podcast, let's talk about the Gulf of Mexico. Let's talk about the hypoxic zone. So essentially what happens as all these nutrients reach the end of the Mississippi River, the mouth of the Mississippi River empties into the Gulf of Mexico, there's a lot of heat at this point. It's the springtime. There's a lot of heat. During that springtime, you get some mixing of that nice hot water. You get sunshine. You get nitrogen, you get oxygen, you get phytoplankton, you get this massive bloom of phytoplankton that is fed by the limiting factor of phosphorus and nitrogen, so it's even bigger and bigger. So depending on how much nitrogen and phosphorus are in the water really depends on the size of the bloom. Now, you're probably wondering, well, look, it's feeding plant life. We do that in our gardens all the time to make sure our gardens grow. True, but you want the right things to grow. You don't want the wrong things to grow. So now I have a pretty big garden, and I am convinced that I'm not a huge gardener in terms of I like gardening, but I am convinced that gardening is not gardening. It's just taking out weeds every week from your garden. That's essentially what you're doing, and it's pretty laborious. I'll be honest, not something something I was ready to jump into when I first bought this house, 20 some odd years ago. But regardless, I still do it each and every week because you have to, because if you fertilize the area, you're going to get growth. And that's what you get with these phytoplankton in the Gulf of Mexico. You get that type of growth. That growth, turns into this huge bloom of phytoplankton. The phytoplankton float across the and mix in across the water column, as well as across the Gulf of Mexico, as the massive water that's coming out of the Mississippi pushes it into the Gulf of Mexico. You get this huge sort of plume, the Mississippi River plume, which is like, probably some sediment as well as anything that comes out of the Mississippi going right into the Gulf of Mexico. And it comes out pretty darn far. And so when you have all these plankton like mixing in the ocean, then all of a sudden the wind stops. If you've ever been down south in the U.S., you know that the wind stops in the summer and it gets hot, and it stays hot until about, August. With that said, when it stays hot and it doesn't mix, eventually that phytoplankton is going to die. It doesn't have a long life. That phytoplankton dies. It sinks to the bottom of the ocean. At the bottom of the ocean, the microbial loops, so the bacteria, start breaking down the dead cells of the plants of this phytoplankton, because it's a plant life. And when it starts to eat it, it takes out oxygen as part of that process. So when there's enough dead phytoplankton, and there's enough microbial loop, it grows. It takes up enough oxygen. It takes it out of the system, and you have a hypoxic zone. Now, the size of the hypoxic zone depends on the size of the plume that lands there. And so it's been as far as Texas. It's been as down further, almost like halfway down the Gulf of Mexico. It's a pretty big area, and it's not a good thing. It's a really, really bad thing that we need to clean up. To clean it up, scientists, when they measure that, they go to Congress and they start to present their results, and they say, look, this is what we're seeing. These are the chemicals that we're seeing in the ocean, and it's a lot of nitrogen, a lot of phosphorus, especially at the mouth of the Mississippi River. We need to limit these two items because these are the items that are the limiting factor of the growth of this plankton, and so it can get really out of place. Now, without this extra nitrogen and phosphorus, you'll still get phytoplankton blooms. Those won't go away, but the amount and the size of the bloom will be limited by the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus in the system. So you just want natural amounts. You don't want a lot. So when you have a lot, you get these big blooms. You get the microbial loop coming in when they're dead. You get the oxygen taken away, and you get a hypoxic zone. So what happens is now Congress gets all that information, and they go back to the areas and the communities, and this is conservation, where you talk to local communities along the Mississippi River to say, hey guys, like, we have a lot of farms along here that are putting out fertilizers on their crops to fertilize the crops, and then that fertilizer ends up running off and going into the system. Now, there's also wastewater plants that are along the entire system, and the wastewater plants have been getting better. They've been getting better at filtering out nitrogen, filtering out phosphorus, but they can't do it all. They can do it only at what we call point sources, where we know where the water that's cleaned up by these wastewater treatment plants are coming into the river. That's at a specific point. It's a point source. And we can measure that point source to ensure that the amount of nitrogen, the amount of ammonia, the amount of phosphorus is limited to a specific amount. It can't go above a specific amount. Now, this amount is modeled, over time to find out like what other things are coming from upstream, coming downstream. And so how does that accumulate, and how is that going to affect at the mouth of the river? So there's huge complex models that are involved in that, but there's a number at the end of that pipe, at that point source, where wastewater engineers and scientists can measure and say, hey, this is a good number. We're okay with this number if it's because that's, but it can't go above that number or else you get fined. And that's the wastewater treatment plant that's run by government and probably counties and so forth. I'm not exactly sure how it works or who's in charge of those wastewater treatment plants along the Mississippi River, because it's different states and different rules and everything. But regardless, there's a point source. Now, there's also non-point sources where the water enters where the fertilizer, the chemicals or the nutrients enter the river at different points along the way, but there's no real one point source. We call them non-point sources. So that includes like fertilizer runoff or soil runoff or anything that could be like coastal erosion or anything like that along the Mississippi. And that's where farms come into play. And that's where farm practices are becoming more and more important to limiting these nutrients from getting into the Mississippi. So what was nice is that at one point, the amount of nitrogen loads that were going into the Mississippi, I think over the last year, decreased by 23% from the baseline period in 2021. However, the 5-year running average, which accounts for extremely wet and dry years, more common with, guess what, climate change, tells a different story. By that measure, nitrogen is only slightly below the baseline and well above the 20% target, so the 20% that they want to reduce. Phosphorus loads worsened since the baseline period, so that's gotten even worse. So that's where we're at right now, right? That's where we're at. So there are specific practices that will help. Where we're looking at reducing the runoff. So the big thing is cover crops. So it's like hay or something that you put on that will go on top of the crops once they're actually harvested, and it goes on the crops and it uptakes all the extra fertilizer, the nutrients from the fertilizer, so it doesn't run off when it rains. And so that helped in keeping it down. The problem with that is that farmers find that they get a lower yield of their actual crop. So it's not just when they're harvested, they put it on top after they put the fertilizer down. But the problem is when they, farmers are thinking, especially old practices, the more fertilizer you have, the more productive your yield's going to be. The more you take it away, even if it's like trace amounts, you're not going to be as productive. And that's what they've noticed in certain farming practices along the Mississippi, is that they've actually gotten a decrease. And so that's not helping. And overall, practices that don't really put in conservation practices in place are acres with reduced tillage, which are acres with tillage or reduced is great. It's down 20%, rose 20% during that time, and no-till was up 9%. But they're also done on a sliver of total harvested acres. So Sarah Carlson, who's an agronomist and senior programs and member engagement director at Practical Farms of Iowa, says, we need every other field in some kind of winter cover to drive down nutrient loss. We are way, way behind. It's not even close. So there's areas where you have to make sure that you minimize the amount of runoff that's going on. It's just not happening. So that's a problem. And like I said before, they're starting to see reduced yields, and that some farmers just can't afford that. It's kind of like when we talk in the ocean about fishers, especially local fishers. They have to pay and feed their families. They have to get paid, feed their families, send them to school in often these cases. In the U.S., maybe not send them to school, but they have to pay to feed their families. And they have other things to pay and to take care of their families. And they just don't have that. Now, the government is putting in money. So the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Natural Resources Conservation Service, NRCS, invested $14.2 billion between the fiscal 2010 and fiscal 2021 on voluntary conservation programs and technical assistance in the 12 task force states, which is Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, Illinois, Missouri, Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, Arkansas, Mississippi, and Louisiana. And the Inflation Reduction Act will spend another $19.5 billion across the country on the climate-smart agriculture, which could include projects with water quality benefits, which is always great. Now, you got to also remember that when plankton get broken down, methane is created, and that's released into the atmosphere. That also contributes to climate change more so than carbon dioxide. Now, some states are also having their own programs to pay for water quality projects. The Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship had spent $1.17 million, which includes federal money to install saturated buffers and bioreactors to filter water from underground drainage tiles before it flows into streams. And farmers do not have to pay anything for those projects. In fact, they actually get $1,000 for each practice that's added to their property. Now, with that said, with those going into place, that's great. It's what's needed. But unfortunately, there are other practices that are making the problem worse. So the number of U.S. acres drained with underground tubes, which essentially act as a superhighway for runoff into streams and rivers, increased by 9.5% from 48.6 million acres in 2012 to 53.1 million acres in 2022. Farmers are also raising 12% more hogs from 66 million in 2012 to 73.8 million hogs in 2022. Combined sales of synthetic fertilizer in 4 Midwest states, Iowa, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, went up 10.6% from fiscal 2016 to fiscal 2020. So the thing it says here, Jones, who's our agronomist across the Midwest report, this is what he says. He says, the thing we never want to talk about is that at the same time we're adopting practices, we're also doing other things on the other side of the ledger to make things worse. So many of our corn acres are being over-fertilized. This is USDA Secretary Tom Vilsack said at a May 3rd event in Illinois. So he says, the farm bill the farm being now being considered in Congress would provide money for research sensors to allow farmers to know exactly how much fertilizer they need to do. Like I said, historical practices say, hey, you know what? If we put out more fertilizer, we'll get a higher percentage of yield, but it's not taking into account how many farmers are along the Mississippi, that highway of water going right down to the Gulf of Mexico, and the effect on the Gulf of Mexico, which affects fishers, ecotourism, all throughout the Gulf of Mexico. So there's a lot to be done here. We're seeing some areas of improvement, but we're also seeing some areas where there's increase of harmful practices to this reduction movement. So, we are still not out of the woods. Although there's capabilities here, we need to increase the capabilities of these farmers. We need to work with more farmers. We need to make sure that, maybe there's a compensation package for them, just like, some people have for fisheries when they can't fish anymore because of a marine protected area. There's got to be something for them to support them. This is not an episode to bash the farmers by any means. This is an episode to say, we need to work better with local farmers. We need to work better to protect the water quality of the Mississippi and, of course, the Gulf of Mexico, to help fisheries in the Gulf of Mexico and people who use the Gulf of Mexico to make their livelihood. And, of course, we need to reduce climate change, which all this will help. So there's a lot going on. There's a lot of money being invested. Is it being invested for the right thing? That's another episode that we could do. But that's the episode for today. I would love to hear your thoughts. Hit me up on Instagram at How to Protect the Ocean. What do you think should be done? If you have any more information on harmful farm practices, or even how farmers are improving the reduction of runoff of their fertilizer, I would love to hear about it, and I'll share it with the collective community, this audience here on the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. If you want to sign up for our newsletter to find out more about not only these practices, but other practices and other conservation issues, you can do so by signing up to our newsletter for free. It's speakupforblue.com/newsletter. That's speakupforblue.com/newsletter. Thank you so much for joining me on today's episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin. Have a great day. We'll talk to you next time, and happy conservation.